This programme was produced at and first aired on MPR, Manawatu People's Radio, with support from New Zealand On Air. Ka pai Irarangi Tamotu, MPR.
Kia ora and welcome to Reserved Recommendations. This is a show about great trash, difficult art, and our complicated relationships with art and culture. My name's Hugh, I'm the host of the show, and I'd like to take this opportunity to put in a very mild content warning for the show as a whole. Sometimes our recommendations on this show are reserved just because the thing that we're discussing is in some way not good, but sometimes there are aspects of the art or artist that may be confronting for some people. Check the episode descriptions for more information, and do be aware of your listening environment. That's right, you are listening to Manawatu People's Radio today, o Irarangi o ngā tangata o Manawatu. This is a radio show and podcast called Reserved Recommendations. We talk about great trash, difficult art, and problematic faves. Today I am joined by Catherine McNamara. How's it going, Catherine? I haven't talked to you in a very long time.
A very long time indeed. Here in sunny Pornic, it's also a bit cloudy, so...
Yeah, I'm getting just like the last of the afternoon sun beaming into my eyes through the studio window off the like glaringly white back wall of the car park behind my work, which is just stunning.
I am cunningly placed in a room that faces the opposite direction.
Yeah, it gives you some very, like, obviously we don't, this is not a visual podcast, we don't, like, publish the video, but you do have some really nice dramatic side lighting going on. It's very good.
I'm closing the curtains so I don't go looking at the clouds.
Yeah,
anyway.
Yeah, fair enough. We're not talking about lighting decisions. We are, in fact, talking about arguably one of the most controversial, problematic faves, at least if you're online. I think there is a point there, because you've been sending me articles over the course of the last couple of weeks, and I think one of the things that's going to be key in this discussion is there's like a difference between people who are quite online and people who are not very online at all. But we are talking about Harry Potter and its associated fandoms. So I guess by way of setting the table, we should like upfront say JK Rowling has decided to be an awful person. Unfortunately, like the way that this works is that once you get embraced by one community of awful people, other people who share some political aims with that group will get on board, and you'll end up getting embraced by other awful people. So consequently, like, you start saying TERF stuff, but then you end up also saying weird racist and anti-feminist and eugenics, and like it just kind of spirals and spirals and spirals.
Yeah. So the takeaway from all this is really don't embrace the awful people in any shape or form.
No, absolutely. Like the joking formulation that I've heard is once you post TERF, you can never post normal ever again. And like it is distressingly close to actual literal truth. I guess like my thesis from all of the stuff that I have read over the years, and also kind of my memories of like the books and the initial reaction to the books and then how things progressed, is that like Harry Potter is as a overall franchise, not just the books, but is both like made and then JK Rowling, and I suspect a lot of like the flaws of the books as books kind of directly derive from her having a really close relationship with fans online. I think that fed a lot of the best of the series and kind of a lot of the worst of it, and her kind of eventual spiral.
She was our queen for a very long time.
That's right, because, you know, she said a lot of the right things in a slightly centrist way, but, you know, generally on the right side of things for a long, long time before she kind of went off the deep end. I guess the reason that I wanted to put this bit of the discussion up front, though, is because, like, the nature of these things is that once someone does dive in that deeply into awful politics, they also become a culture war issue. And so it's really kind of necessary to stake your position up front before you can then have a more nuanced discussion about anything else. So I wanted to do that.
Yes. Trans men are men, trans women are women, non-binary and people are non-binary. I support them and love them all.
But precisely. And, it's also like race science is garbage. No one is genetically predisposed to want slavery as a life condition.
Oh dear God, no.
However, all of that stuff aside for now, it may well come back. Like, what was the connection that you had with Harry Potter as a franchise? Like books, movies, all of those things that made this worth being a conversation worth having for you.
Well, I've just been going back through some of my old posts. I'm early 40s. When the Potter books came out when I was in my mid to late teens, is when they started coming out. I was working in the school as a student librarian in the school library. I was wondering what this book was that everybody was reading. I went overseas on an exchange year, and that's where I first read Harry Potter, because I bought a copy of the books for some other people in English when I went on a trip to England, and they said, "You read it first because you'll take less time than us." So I did. So I basically binge read the first 3 or 4 books. And because I was in a country that did not speak English, I was like thirsty for English. So I read them all. And then I came back and I went to university, and I got a hold of a copy of book 4 and book 5. And this was when the internet was starting to become a really big thing. And so there were podcasts, and podcasts came a little bit later, but there were fan sites. And I was at uni, and so I had a bit of time on my hands to scroll through the internet. And so not only was I enjoying these stories full of whimsy and funny names and things, but there was this whole other thing that opened up, this community that opened up around it. It wasn't just me and a couple of my mates going, "You should read this book, it's fun."
Yeah, I think like that's interesting, because the reason that I read all of the books kind of as they came out, I was into them, but I was just generally into fantasy as a thing, so it was part of my general kind of fantasy diet. And I'm a couple of years older than you, and I think I didn't lock into them quite so much because I was just that little bit too old at that point.
Possibly, yeah.
And also I suspect if I'd been stuck in a situation where I was starving for English language fiction, my response to them might have been quite different,
Possibly, yeah. I also, so I read them and got into the books, and then podcasts became a thing that I could listen to. There were fan sites putting out podcasts, and I really enjoyed the discussion of the text, the close reading, the thoughts, and then and this all basically became, so for that was early 2000s, so for the next nearly 20 years I was listening to a podcast on the regular. 1 or 2 eventually, maybe even 3 or 4 podcasts that were Potter related. Rereads, discussions on there was Mugglecast, Aloha Mora, which is a reread, MuggleNet Academia, where they talked about topics within using the books. There was big discussions about ring theory, where books 1 and book 7 connect, and books 2 and 6 connect, and they all sort of revolve around book 4, and we all kind of went, whoa, and got our minds blown. And so that was fun, and that was really interesting. And then I watched the movies. I've got them all on DVD. I had all the books. I gave them away a couple of years back, but I had the books, read everything, listened to podcasts galore. I was very much Potter, and if anyone bought me a present, such as my husband when he went away for souvenirs, something Potter related usually came back for me.
I do think that is like a big part of why the books became such an enormous phenomenon with because I've got 2 kids at home and one much older stepdaughter who's now off at university, but one of the two kids is super into Harry Potter, and it just something about it just hits certain kids exactly right, and it's their thing for a while. And I mean, every kid has, I suspect, like the book series that will do that for them. And for a lot of them, it's Harry Potter. But with like people who are kind of too old to be in at least the target bracket for the first book, because they do kind of like age up as you go along.
Yes, I was not 11 when it came out. I was 16, 17,
But the reason that they kind of connect so much is there is that, like, they did coincide perfectly with that growth of online fan culture.
Yeah.
They were one of the first things where you could have that kind of relationship with it. And then, like, not only was there books, but there were also movies. And then there are completely transformative things, like my oldest daughter, my stepdaughter, who was not really into Harry Potter that much at all, was super into, like, the nonsense Potter Puppet Pals stuff, because that was kind of in the zeitgeist for kids her age at the point when she was
Severus Snape, Dumbledore.
Yeah, exactly.
Severus Snape. Yep.
That was exactly the right sense of humor when she was the right age for that thing, and so she was obsessed with that without really connecting to any other part of it.
Yeah, and so there was a lot of, as I said, the whimsy. I was pretty much the right age. I didn't grow up with Harry Potter because I never saw Harry as like my age equal. And, I mean, I was close enough in that age that I remembered how I felt when I was 11. I remembered how I felt when I was 13 or 14. Close enough to the angst. But the whimsy and the stories, and then going back through the podcast and the details. And then, yes, as you said, with the podcast, with the fandom in general, and the availability of JK Rowling online, was understanding, her point of view and her interaction with the fandom, and then the careful plotting and the details you could find on multiple rereads that I'd never done like that before, and so it was engrossing, and there seemed to be a lot more they could give, and just the fandom alone could pull out all these things.
It's interesting that you say careful plotting, because, like, now, to be fair, I have not revisited the books in a while, partly because I didn't have them, and I was not sufficiently motivated to go and seek them out without just like having them in the house. But my impression of Harry Potter was that JK Rowling often made stuff up as she was going along. It often didn't feel especially carefully plotted, although it may well have become so, like, as she got further through and started calling back to things. But particularly the early books, a lot of it seemed like she kind of went, I need a thing to do this. It'll be. And, like, elements kind of seemed not like incongruous necessarily, but just like they were kind of called out of whole cloth, and there wasn't necessarily a lot of like in-world justification for exactly how they worked or anything like that. All that stuff seemed to come later.
I mean, admittedly, while I was a voracious reader and read all the Terry Pratchett in the world and things like that, I was not, and I was good at English. I was never a literary critic, so I wasn't reading it with that sort of lens. But when you look at also I would say probably in her defence, she probably wasn't expecting to write 7 books.
Oh no, absolutely! Like I looking at the first Harry Potter novel, that could have been like a moderately successful standalone novel, or it could have spawned, a perfectly acceptable like trilogy.
Yeah.
And it does seem like she was caught by surprise by exactly how big it became, and then went, I need to come up with a lot more story.
I think anybody would have been surprised by how big it became, because it was literally a phenomenon. Yeah. I think so. I'm having to call back. I remember careful plotting because it's been 4 odd years since I've read the books, since I've been involved. But there was always these little details that harkened back to other things, and things that connected, and plot lines that echoed within. That's what I was meaning by the ring theory. And then there was, the names and the bits of lore that got pulled in. And there was, little bits that were pulled through the, seeds that were sown in book 1 and 2. And when you're doing rereads, having read the whole book and read them so many times that you remember them, and then you go back and you read this thing and you go, hey, wait, that person, seemingly throwaway, 5 books ago. Huh.
Right. Well, you're probably benefiting from more regular and careful reading than I am on that one.
Probably, yeah.
I mean, I guess one of the things that struck me about that idea, I guess, of kind of coming up with stuff on the fly is that being kind to JK Rowling, that is perhaps how, like, some of the stuff in the novels is straightforwardly problematic by itself, like the idea that house elves are a species who desire to live in slavery is like, that's a weird thing to put in your fantasy world and then just not comment on at all. And you can have similar criticisms of like Star Wars. There are a number of sentient slave races and no one remarks on it at all, and it's deeply weird the longer you think about it. And I think in both cases that's someone said something, but they didn't really think about what the implications of what they were saying were until, in JK Rowling's case, later. And then even the point at which, like, house elves desiring to be slaves is sort of justified as the right state of things, I still don't really think that she thought that, like, the moral implications of that through.
Yeah. But also, I mean, I'm also considering that I think the moral and sociocultural norms that she started writing the books in was different. The world has progressed an awful lot in 20-odd years. And this was 30-odd years ago that I think she started writing them. So it could have been just, this was a funny notion when she started writing it, and then it became embedded in the plotline, and I can't change it now.
No, that's exactly the kind of thing I'm thinking. And I think there is a certain amount of, like, it's the sort of thing where if we were talking about books from 40 years ago or 50 years ago, we would go, ugh, that's an unfortunate, and we would sort of roll past it. I think, as I was saying at the start, I think one of the major elements there is the way that she was interacting with the community, because, you can look at Roald Dahl and you can go, this guy's got a real thing for, like, a kind of sadism in the way that he punishes his villains. But Roald Dahl's dead, right? He's not going to get on Twitter and go, I'm being cancelled, because he's dead.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the thing. Yeah, so there's 2 points to that. There's JK Rowling is around to be actively hurting people and actively doubling down and actively refusing to say sorry and learn. And that is disappointing when you consider how she had said the right things up until then, basically, unless you knew the dog whistles that apparently had been there a little bit beforehand that I had been unaware of because I've been focusing on the rereads of the books. What was the other thing? So, there's
I mean, it's like she's alive and reactive, and she's also reacting in the wrong, in quote unquote wrong, but like, she's reacting in ways that are very unhelpful and seem to double down on her worst impulses.
Yeah, so she's wishing she can't change it, but she maybe could have re-envisioned. Oh, that was the other thing, was the but particularly like the house elf storyline, was that ultimately I think it became a plot point for Ron to show that he wasn't a dick. With Hermione with the SPEW, the spew, pushing for that, and then Ron showing that he actually had been listening to her all along and wasn't an complete ask when he was like, oh, we've got to go and get in the final battle, we've got to go and get the house elves out of the kitchens, they shouldn't be fighting for us or pulled into our wars. Whereas a couple of books before that he'd been going, we should get them to help us. Yeah, they can do all these crazy things, they're mad, let's hurt them. And I think it was there to show some character development for Ron, which in itself, trashing a whole people, a whole sort of species to be character development for one character is not the best approach, but I think she was using it in that way.
Yeah, no,
better or worse.
I think that's a very fair way of putting it, and I don't think it lets her off the hook, right? Because I mean, you mentioned Terry Pratchett at the start, and I think like there is definitely a distinction between early Pratchett and late Pratchett, or even early and mid-period Pratchett, where he does become more careful as he goes along. But Pratchett at his best will go, what does this fantasy concept or this class of entity or whatever the thing is that I want to talk about in this book, like what does it imply about people and the way that they work? And then the stuff that happens in the book, including the comedy, because he was a funny writer.
It's all about twisting the expectations for him, Yeah,
absolutely. And like starting with that concept and then exploring it as you go along quite deliberately, in a way that I don't think JK Rowling ever would necessarily have even claimed that she was trying to do, No,
I think, she was writing specifically for children. He wrote some books for children, but most of them were for adults. So I don't know if there was any editorial input in that respect. But yeah, it's very much a thing of its time, but she is of now. And that's, I suppose, moves into the general fandom, is that from her books having some good things and then people reading them so deeply and then thinking about these things and they're like, actually that thing, the house elf thing, not great. Using this name, the use of these different cultures, and perhaps what could be what felt good to me as a 20-something years ago going, oh, she's so smart, she's including all these cool things, but to someone who is from that group feels insulting and demeaning. But then the fandom talks about that, and it made them became one aspect that helped them become much more tolerant, much more expecting of good behaviour.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I do think like that's been one of the really interesting things about, like there is an element of organized fandom that is always insufferable, and that's true of every single fandom, and like Harry Potter fandom is absolutely not immune to it. But because it had such a massive and such a broad appeal, you could see people having these really interesting social justice or philosophical discussions based on the Potter milieu, because they could go, remember when Ron said X, and just expect people to know what that meant. So it was a useful example.
And it's a good text for, like, I think there have been, at least in the past, I don't know if there still are, but there were university courses, just like there were university courses on the Lord of the Rings, the university courses that talked about Harry Potter, and these as tying into different cultural or academic topics. So as a shared text, it's really useful in that way. But,
and I mean, a lot of I think one of the things that is a virtue of JK Rowling, at least at the start, is that she was very supportive of like expansive and fan created works, because a lot of the interesting stuff that came out of Harry Potter, and a lot of the stuff, like one of the articles you sent me is like there's a really live like fan-made Harry Potter prequel scene, which I know nothing about and have no particular desire to engage with, but actually that's the kind of thing that JK Rowling was really encouraging of at the start.
I think I would beg to do a slight differ. I think there was, when it came to fanfic, she was not a big fan. I think she was happy with the intellectual engagement and the analysis and the discussion, but I don't think, maybe it changed in future, but I know at one point she was not happy about fanfic. She's like, if you want to write your own stories. Come up with your own ideas.
No, well, in that case, I've put her on what I consider the wrong side of that debate. I had remembered...
She may have changed, but not what I remember.
Yeah, no, I had remembered her being compared favourably to other people like Anne Rice, who were exceptionally hostile to fan fiction, but I may be simply misremembering that bit of internet fandom discourse because I have not paid attention for a long time.
She may have at some point just gone, well, I can't stop it now. But I'm pretty sure I remember a thing saying, I wish you'd write about your own stories.
And look, that's not an uncommon point of view, although, like, you know, fan fiction goes back and back and back and back and back, and arguably, you know, Dante's Inferno and Divine Comedy, which are, you know, part of the Western canon, are a Bible fanfic. With a super cool Mary Sue original character, do not copy, who gets all the best lines and to hang out with super cool saints and, you know.
Yes, I mean, there's that. Also, I must say, fanfic is not something I delved into too deeply. I did read one or two bits, but I was definitely more of a podcast and a reread kind of person. Yeah. And interested in all the news and the movie depictions and stuff. I liked all of that stuff. But I was, never really got into the fanfic too much. I enjoyed some of the fan websites that had, there was MuggleNet used to have a caption contest, where they'd post pictures like on a weekly basis from the movies, and people would caption them, and some of them would be hilarious, and I'd read through and giggle and giggle and giggle, and so and then maybe some of them go, yeah, but the next three would be like, quality, excellent, I like what you did, I see what you did there, nice one.
I am interested to talk about the movies, because I do think there's like an interesting point of inflection there as well. However, we are around about at the halfway break, so we are going to take a brief break, and we will be back right after this.
Support this show and others like it by giving a donation. For more information, go to www.mpr.nz/donate.
You're listening to Manawatu People's Radio, Te Reo Irarangi o ngā Tangata o Manawatu. This is Reserved Recommendations, a radio show and podcast where we talk about great trash, difficult art, and problematic faves. I am talking to Catherine McNamara about the whole Harry Potter thing. And I was interested to talk about the movies because I have an intuition, and you're probably more clued up about it than I am, that some of the overwhelming affection for the franchise, particularly in the States, is perhaps related to them getting the movies more than the books. The reason I say that is that, and you might disagree with me here, but my memory of the books is that they kind of become harder going the further into the series you get. Like that, the amount of stuff that's a bit hard to slog through if you're not super interested in things like Quidditch, relative to the rest of it, kind of expands and expands as it goes along. And I feel like the movies streamline a fair bit of that stuff, but I might be wrong there.
They do. There's certainly always lots of fan discussion about what do they miss, what scenes would we like them to put in. Everything that comes up whenever an adaptation of anything comes up. So when, for example, the Percy Jackson adaptations in the movies and things, at least they were not the Percy Jackson movie adaptations.
I have heard very good things about the Percy Jackson TV show from the 16-year-old in the house who was a big Percy Jackson head.
We can put onto the unreserved recommendation put at the end. But yeah, so there's the adaptation dramas. Whenever there's an adaptation of anything and things that you missed out, certainly. But I don't think I got the impression that the books. I mean, because all of the podcasts I listened to were mostly Americans. There was like Mugglecast had Jamie, who was the British host, and he'd come on and say a British joke of the week. and things like that, which is just usually some awful pun. But the podcasts, they were definitely book-based, reread-based. And while the movies were wonderful in many ways, and their faithfulness to the text and the way they, the sheer detail that they put into the production. I was on my way when I was just before I went to China. I went via Sydney and was able to catch the exhibition that went round when it was in Sydney there, and was able to look at the details of the costuming, and that sort of the production level of detail was something that fans enjoyed, because of course there's fantastic merch opportunities, and craft opportunities for those who want to make their own things. And cosplay options and all those sorts of things that you can do, that probably would have not have been there if it had just remained books. But I think the movies would have streamlined a bunch of the things, and they missed out a few key plot details, like Creature, not the house elf, not showing up until the 7th movie, and then you're going, who is he? And people who read the books going, looking side eyes at movie 5, going, come on, you had an opportunity, where's Creature then? And things like that, and various details that didn't hit right. But I think that's just adaptation missing things out. But I wouldn't say I would agree with you that it was big in the States because of the movies, because the books were such a thorough text for everybody. I think the movies, the books, after the first 2 or 3, I think the American editors stopped changing so much of the language, like the rubbish bin and the garbage bin and the 2 American texts, and there was no more sort of sorcerer's stone for the poor American brains that can't comprehend what a philosopher is. But I think when it became a big enough of a behemoth, cultural behemoth, that there was enough of a sheer text, they didn't need to explain these things so much. And if you didn't understand what a thing was, you went onto one of the fan sites and you asked somebody, and some American or British or someone would say, well, that means this.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, it's, turnabout is fair play, given that everybody else has that experience with American media all of the time.
Just because your accent's loudest doesn't mean it's the right one.
No, and there are some things which are recurring. Like, I listen to probably too many podcasts, and there are things that people treat as there are things that people treat on American podcasts as like self-evident cultural touchstones, which are just like utter gibberish to a New Zealander, because we don't have that store or ubiquitous kind of sandwich or whatever the thing is that you're talking about. We do not understand your regional beef between like these 2 cities. None of it makes any sense at all.
But they're just loudest, so they're most well known. But yeah, so it's good for them to have it come back the other way. Expand your world. Yes, expand your world, boyos. Yeah. So that, but yeah, it was all very text-based, and the movies were fun, but I think my primary love was always going to be the books.
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to be disagreed with. It was a thing that I noticed when I watched the movies with my kids, was that they move along quite quick, whereas the books do get bogged down in some stuff at some points. And also,
they did make, of course, 2 movies out of the final book.
Oh, well, I mean, they made 2 books out of the final book as well.
But by then the fandom was like, oh, this detail, give me the detail. I want to know everything. Tell me.
Yeah, absolutely. And boy, howdy did JK Rowling oblige.
Book 5 really would have. Book 5 was the monster. That was the biggest. I think the editor had both, either she'd learned or one of the editors had found a way to help her cut down. But by book 5, there was a lot in book 5, and it is one of my least favourite of the books.
I strongly suspect it may be book 5 that actually kind of poisoned me on the series. Like I'm quite this is perhaps a flaw as a reader, but I'm quite unforgiving of when something really beds into its foibles in that way. I similarly poisoned myself off the Wheel of Time and will probably never finish that series because I
did.
Well, you have more stamina than I for this stuff, but I reached a critical amount of pursed lips and tossed hair or hands on hips or whatever it was, and I was
braids getting tugged on.
That was the one, tugging on braids. Yes. Mm-hmm.
But yes, I was 13 when I started reading The Wheel of Time, but I was at uni, I believe, when the last one came out, in my early 20s. So it was a decade or so of difference, and my whole worldview had sort of become more complicated, and I've done a lot more gender studies as well. And so I was able to look at it and go, yeah. But speaking as a person who has had a long braid, tugging on it is excellent.
I mean, I recommend to anyone who can grow a beard that they should, at least to try, because it's very satisfying to have something on your chin that you can just sort of thoughtfully stroke or tug on if you need to.
I was often curling the end of my braid around my fingers, and it was excellent for tickling when I taught kids in China. And tickling them with my braid was an excellent way of melting the ice. Because then they'd go and grab my hair, and it's like, oh. Yes. Anywho.
Where we've arrived at is that JK Rowling, be damned, there is some stuff of value and interest there. Where we arrived as a family, because we kind of had to have this discussion because, one kid was super into Harry Potter and another kid was non-binary. So we needed to go, we need to reckon with this in some way.
Yes,
and where we arrived was, we're not going to tell any relatives not to buy Harry Potter merch because that raises conversations that we are unprepared to have with certain family members in certain places.
Yeah.
But we are not going to buy any Harry Potter thing if it's not secondhand.
Yeah.
So we've gone through and bought the books secondhand from the Red Cross and places like that.
Yeah. Probably discarded by people like me who'd read the books and gone and then looked at that and gone, I cannot separate the art from the artist. Give away the books. And piles of them would appear on secondhand bookshelves.
Well, certainly, I mean, that's a thing that I found very difficult to do because I read the first one to the kid who was like, oh, my friends are into Harry Potter. I must have Harry Potter.
Yes.
And then was starting to get into it. So I read the first book to her. And I was finding it difficult, but I think there is stuff of value there if you can find a way to not support JK Rowling financially. That's where I landed.
Yeah, my big thing, I you would have seen since we've been friends for that long, my posts presumably on the matter, if Facebook algorithms would let you. But I did a lot of thinking about this when it came out because I was 3 or 4 podcasts every week. Life was Potter related. I went through, because I have, friends of friends who are trans, children of friends who are trans, and I'm like, I don't want to hurt them. That would be bad. So I did I was thoroughly disappointed with her. I was took a bit of a lead from some of the podcasts. There was at least Aloha Mora and Leaky Mug. The Leaky Mug did the Leaky Cauldron fan website. Leaky Mug was a combo of Mugglecast and the Leaky podcast. They called themselves the Leaky Mug. So I they had some great rebuttals saying, we support the trans people, the queer community, LGBTQIA, all that plus. We support your people, but we believe the fandom, so we're going to basically cut out JK Rowling. We'll talk about some of the things, but not about what she's doing, because that used to be some of the things I'd say. She'd announce she was reading, or she tweeted a thing, and they'd talk about it. We're not going to do that anymore. There was some like donating to charities and some fundraising stuff that went around specifically to give money towards trans people, charities that support trans people. And so I was glad about that the fandom and like even Daniel Radcliffe and Emma Watson, the stars of the movies, had their statements saying, "This ain't cool." And so I sort of took heart from that, but then I went through my own thinking and I read all the books again because I'd mostly when I've been listening to podcasts, I hadn't actually read the books for a while because I remember them so well that I could just listen to the podcast and go, oh yeah, that bit. Oh no, they're talking about that bit wrong. And so I reread them with the view in mind of, do I like this text enough to hold on to it and read it again? What was the value I was getting out of it? And the value, and I decided by the end of reading the 7 books, is like, 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 were fine, 5, 6 I enjoyed, 7 was good, but all in all, I'm ready to say goodbye. And what I enjoyed was the discussion and the because I was commenting on fan sites on podcast episodes. I was even a guest on one of on Aloha Mora once on the episode discussing Ron Weasley. And so I sort of put that aside, and then I gave my books to a friend who had a kid who was of an age to want to read Harry Potter, because I knew that she would be able and willing to talk about the harder stuff with her child as they went through it. I was intending to go through my movies at some point and watch them and decide to get rid of them, but I haven't touched them in 5 years, so I probably should just give them away. And I've still got some other books that JK Rowling wrote, her Robert Galbraith series that I haven't even touched yet. I should go through and read them at some point as well and decide what I'm going to do with them. But I just decided to move on, and then my friends gave me some links to some other books. If you like Harry Potter, disappointed with JK Rowling, here's something else you could read. And so I read a bunch of different series of books that were sort of British school, like boarding school, fantasy-esque, or some other things, but like openly queer, accepting ones and things like that. And read all that and had a lot of fun. And I listened to Potterless, a series of podcasts by a man called Mike Schubert, who was a grown adult man who had never read the books. And his perspective was really useful for me in some ways, because he didn't love the books. He wasn't talking about the details of the book from someone who already loved them. He was enjoying them, but he was far enough removed emotionally from them to be able to find the flaws and go, yeah, that wasn't cool. So that was really useful. That helped me sort of get a different perspective. And since then, I listened to other things he does. I've found all these other book series to read, and I've listened to top podcasts on much different topics. So I'm basically an ex Potterhead, really, at this stage.
I think certainly one of the things that insulated me from the charm of them a little bit was that my dad, when he was a kid, had been super into the Just William books, which are like English boarding school stories. And he read me those when I was quite small. And then he read me, I can't remember the name of the series, but it was like a German version of the same thing. And so when I encountered Harry Potter, I wasn't quite so like, wow, this is completely new. I was like, it's one of those things that I've read a few of that like mostly are 19th century. It's interesting that there's one that's new.
Yeah.
And so it always felt just that touch kind of derivative in that way.
I certainly never got the Just William series read to me. No, though I was read, like my nana used to read the Narnia books to me. J.K. Rowling is less explicitly Christian, but there's still that milieu does definitely, in that cultural dominance does, loom large.
I read all of my kids the Just So stories, and Rudyard Kipling, if you go more broadly into his writing, and even actually if you are incautious with which Just So stories you look at, gets incredibly racist really fast. So you just have to be very selective, and then when they're old enough to get it and to want to read the books themselves, you have to go, this was an actively colonialist author writing deliberately colonialist fiction. But what I wanted was that Rudyard Kipling also had a completely unchallenged grasp of the sound of the English language. And so if you want to hypnotize a small child to sleep, it's very hard to do better than really good Rudyard Kipling stories, because there's something about the sound of them that just grabs small children and hypnotizes them. And then they'll just, and it's great. So it's my parenting tip or dealing with small children tip. But you do have to make sure, like, he's not going to tell you the secret origin of black people, because he does do that as well.
Oh, yes. So secret it's not even real. Thus speaketh the anthropologist.
No, turns out they did it on purpose to get better at hunting.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
Right. I suppose that's why Homo sapiens gave it up and the Neanderthals all died out or something. Anywho.
I mean, I do think, like, what we're kind of circling around here is there is a skill in critically engaging with this stuff, because you mentioned C.S. Lewis as well, another man who I am eternally grateful never encountered Twitter. The thought of C.S. Lewis on Twitter is just like,
oh boy.
I mean, in some ways he would have been the best at it, but also the worst.
Yes, that or no, Tolkien on Twitter would have been entertaining.
I can imagine Tolkien on Twitter being like a 1 of 37 guy, but probably in a good way.
Hopefully. Yeah. But C.S. Lewis, I mean, this is also, I read them a lot when I was a child, and I was going to church regularly with my parents, with my mother in particular. And so there was a certain element of those books I didn't question. But, give me 10 or 20 years, 10 or 15 years down the track when I don't go to church anymore, and I look at them and I go, well, that wasn't blatant in the slightest. That metaphor is totally subtle. Yeah.
Yeah, no, absolutely. But there is, they are kind of canonical for a reason. And so if you can work out how to engage with them critically with your kids, or for yourself, then there is value there.
I mean, I think, the thing that, watching the movies when they come out, and then I'm like, oh, Ben Barnes, Prince Caspian, yum. So, that sort of thing took over. But you've got to be, it's critical, and having someone there to help you be critical, either it's someone you talk to or it's a fandom that has become more critical, can be definitely a good guide. But you just got to be careful about who you trust with helping you understand it. But also, as an adult who knows better, actively choosing, people who will not disappoint us, i.e. Terry Pratchett is never going to disappoint us. There is safety there. Rick Riordan with Percy Jackson and things, he seems to be someone who has learned and developed and grown as well. But all the other queer authors, I've got to remember the name of some of those books, but I've forgotten all of the ones I read. But there was a great series of lists. I should share them. You can put the links to them or something like that if I find them again.
Yep. No, absolutely. Well, look, we are coming up to that time. Thank you very much for talking. This has been a lot of fun and
try to stop me talking.
Very illuminating to talk to someone who's been more engaged with this stuff than I have, because I was sort of aware of it through being online and knew enough from having read the books that I could get what people were talking about, but I was never really part of the fandom. So that's been very helpful for me.
Yes.
Do you have things that you remember that you would like to recommend? Obviously, I would absolutely recommend Pratchett for anyone who hasn't got into him. He actually came and talked to my high school, and one of the things that he said was that he thought that if he assessed one of his own strengths, it was that his books would appeal to an imaginary 10-year-old boy called Craig and also Craig's mum. Like, I wouldn't have any reservations about putting kids who are confident readers onto Pratchett.
Yeah. And here's children's books that can be read to you, which give, joy to both the parents who are reading it and to the child who's being read to. Certainly a lot of those books can be read with care. I don't know much about more recent books, but there's a couple of different things I'd recommend in terms of media you could consume. So there's Potterless, the podcast, that is without Potterless. He's read through all the books. He still does episodes on it occasionally. Goes through chapter by chapter, discusses what it makes predictions, discusses whether or not his predictions were wildly off base, and so on and so forth, with compassion for minority groups and with a sense of humour, and a rotating cast of friends who have read the books who quietly don't go whenever he makes a wildly off-base prediction. I would recommend that, and basically any other podcasts he does. The only one I don't listen to of his is Horse, because I'm not interested in basketball. I know that the Alohomora podcast is still putting out episodes. I have not listened to them, but they're still putting out episodes as of March 2024, as our Mugglecast. So they are, if they are still holding to their leave out JK Rowling, just talk about the books and the fandom, then that should still all be great. You will find online, if you want to, there are lists. There's like a meme of like a nice infographic of pictures of books saying, if you don't like J.K. Rowling, read these. There was one that was about kids who were basically art becoming magic, and there was this magical island they went to. There was a wonderful one about basically a queer couple of a vampire and a magic user and at a boarding school, and it was all very gay and fantastic. I'm currently rereading the Percy Jackson books for the first time as a 40-something-year-old woman, but enjoying them immensely. And on that note of that, one of the former hosts of Alohomora, Michael Harley, was on a podcast with the Potterless guy on his Percy Jackson Newest Olympian podcast, and he discussed a podcast he's starting. I haven't yet found it. I've been looking for it and Googling it from the name he gave us. I can't find it yet. Something like Pottering Off. But he is a children's librarian, a youth librarian in the States. And so he is like going to do a podcast where he talks about alternatives, things you could read. And this is from the perspective of a gay man of colour in the US with a brother who is has some sort of learning disability or something. He would read Harry Potter to him, but he's got all these other books that he would recommend on the podcast. So I thoroughly recommend that. Just knowing what he has been like in the past, and presuming that past behaviour indicates future behaviour, that should be good value. Yeah,
that all sounds great. I would add to that this is a reserved recommendation of its own, because these are books that are also of their time and translated from Russian. But I want to recommend them because they came out during the period of Harry Potter dominance. And so you used to be able to find them with jacket notes that said like the Russian Harry Potter. The Night Watch series of novels, which are about the like Cold War between good and evil wizards, and the complicated bureaucracy that exists to make sure that neither side takes any action without permission from the other. It's not even remotely Harry Potter. It's much more about like aimed at grown-ups and about complex and dangerous government bureaucracy where everyone is a wizard and can like turn you into an owl if you make them mad. But it's very interesting, and it's very interesting to see the kind of thing that people were saying, oh, this is definitely like Harry Potter, because it had wizards in it at the time.
Okay, just going back and checking. So Rainbow Rowell is this author of the Simon Snow trilogy. She's the one with the vampire and the man with the wings, the magical man, the wonderful queer trilogy. She's great. I wish I could remember them. 4 years ago, I knew the names of these books.
Well, there you go. I've clearly
I
waited.
just read them and was enjoying them massively.
I clearly waited too long to talk to you about
but
this.
I needed some perspective.
The other thing that I would...
Perspective is wonderful, but sometimes that's too small to read.
The other thing that I would recommend putting kids onto, if they're interested in magic and its implications, would be the Earthsea books by Ursula Le Guin, which are, again, not especially Potter-like because her view of magic is much more metaphysical than JK Rowling's. But they're a very good introduction to some philosophical concepts aimed at kids, at least to start with, and you can conveniently get all 4 books in the Earthsea series bound in one volume, which is about the size of half of the final Harry Potter book.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I would also say Tamora Pierce.
Yes, yeah, I was going to mention her and I'd forgotten her, so thank you very much for bringing her up. Tamora Pierce. Absolutely.
Yeah. Quality female characters. She has specifically weighed in on this issue at some point and said, I am open to you all.
Yeah, I was going to say with Tamora Pierce, because of the point at which her books were written, they're not explicitly queer, but there is some really interesting gender stuff in them, which makes them kind of fertile ground for having those sorts of discussions and being that sort of representation in some ways.
Like, is Caladri of Mindel Ace and things like that. Yeah. Okay, so there's The Spook's Apprentice by Joseph Delaney, that series. They're actually pretty damn scary. I was reading them in 2022, listening to the audiobooks and actually going, I don't think I want to go past book 3 because that's actually kind of spooky. There was, let's see, Rainbow Roll, her series of Simon Snow. I did listen to the first Percy Jackson books. Patricia C. Reed, Calling on Dragons, Dealing with Dragons. That's always fun. The Islands, no, hang on, that's not that one. The Howl's Moving Castle. Ah,
yes, Diana Wynne Jones, yes, hard to go wrong.
Excellent movie as well as, Philip Pullman has his own issues as well, I presume, but the Lyra books are great and his Dark Materials. It was The Island, okay, Lisa McMahon wrote a series of books. I'm just trying to find number 1 in that series. Thanks to Libby, I've got my reading history. Book 1 in that series was The Unwanteds by Lisa McMahon. And then there's Soman Chainani's The School for Good and Evil. That series as well. Also highly recommended and highly amusing. I think those are the ones, yes. School for Good and Evil, The Unwanteds, the Carry On series will give you a chunk of reading multiple books. And the audiobooks, because I tend to read these things by audiobooks, are also good value. So I highly recommend them and Potterless.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much for all of that. By way of signing off, do you have anything that you want to plug?
I'm pretty quiet. I keep my socials pretty to me. Plugging. I mean, if the only thing I might recommend is I do have a Madfall. I'm a member of the Society for Creative Journalism. I have a Madfall project where I am growing my own linen flax, which is not the same as New Zealand flax. My own linen flax and trying to process it and spin it and weave it into something. So I have a blog about that on WordPress. Grow My Own Garb. .wordpress.com. So if you're vaguely interested in weird textile nonsense.
And look, any recommendation that gets people off the 3 websites full of screenshots of the other ones is always worthwhile. Thank you very much for talking to me, Catherine.
There's a whole wide world on WordPress.
You've been listening to Reserved Recommendations, a radio show and podcast from Manawatu People's Radio, Te Reo Irirangi o ngā tangata o Manawatu. The show was produced and presented by me, Hugh Dingwall, and I also composed our theme music. It's called Sack Jazz, and you can find it at wolfboy.bandcamp.com. If you enjoyed this show, why not go ahead and share it with a friend? You can find the last 10 episodes at npr.nz/show/reserved or wherever else you get your podcasts. If you want an episode older than that, try searching for Reserved Recommendations on YouTube. You can find me on Twitter at Objective Realty, or you can follow the show on Facebook. And finally, Manawatu People's Radio is a non-profit community access station. If you like this or any other piece of their fine audio programming, why not fling them $1 or $2? You can go to npr.nz/donate for more information on how to do that.